Be the change you want to see. Mahatma Gandhi. Welcome to the Guyana Dialogue. I'm your host, Shamiza Ali. Our topic tonight is a glimpse into the 2026 budget and what's in it for the ordinary person. The Guyana Dialogue is being sponsored by Coordinating Council of Guyanese based in the US, UK, Canada, the Caribbean, and Guyana. Funding support is by well known philanthropist Dave Narayan from Dave West Indian Imports. Please welcome my moderator for tonight, Dr. Tara Singh.
Thank you very much, Shamiza.
And joining us shortly will be our panelists, Dr. Vishnu Bisram and Professor Mahindra Hariraj. Our guest tonight is a financial analyst and CEO of Spherex Professional Services. Please welcome Joel Bhagwandin, and he is no stranger to the Guyana Dialogue. Good evening and welcome, everyone.
Good evening, Shamiza.
Welcome. Dr. Tara, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. And as you just stated, our two other panelists are supposed to join us a bit late in the program. We take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Joel Bhagwandin. As you know, he's a financial analyst. And as you just said, the director of Spherex Professional Services. But more than that, he has been active writing stories and articles in the legacy media as well as in social media. So in a kind of way, he's also a social commentator on the economic and social and political conditions in Guyana. Now, before we go into ask you about, give us some highlights or glimpses into the budget, and in particular to reference what impact it will have at the household or communal level. I just want to ask you a little about the census that was just released, the 2022 census. Most of the data I've seen, I look through the report, they have region by gender, region by household size. I didn't see anything about region by race, by age, by income, by education. Would that be the second and final part of the census? If you can clarify that, I was trying to get an answer to that, but so far I wasn't able to do that. So if you can throw some light on that, we'll appreciate. So go ahead.
Yeah. My understanding is that those other elements of the study will be released at a later date.
At a later date. Okay. All right. Thank you. The census conducted since 2022, 26, 4 years. I hope that it's not too late because as an important tool for economic planning, economic and social planning, the census is foundational material for that. Yeah, going back to the budget, I just received the copy of the budget speech. I glimpsed through it, but I know you're up to date with that. So if you can give us what you consider the main highlights of the budget, and then you can focus secondly on how it will affect the people at the local level or the household level. So if you can go ahead, you can talk, you can do it region by region or sector by sector, whatever. So you can proceed, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tara. Thank you, Shamisa. Good evening to your viewers. Let me first say Happy New Year. I think the year is still new. Happy New Year to your viewers, and to those in the diaspora. It is always a pleasure to participate in this forum to exchange our views and insights and analysis on these topical issues, what is going on in Guyana. Um, I would like to begin by dealing with the impact firstly, rather than going through the budget, the highlights of the budget. I think the highlights of the budget is now by now is well documented all across various spheres of the public domain, social media, everywhere. Um, we've all seen the allocations made in the various sectors, particularly the social services sector, healthcare, education. There is a big focus and drive in the agriculture sector. There's a lot of emphasis in agro processing. Um, what what stood out to me in the agriculture sector that I'm very pleased about is the allocation for the development of 100,000 acres of agricultural land for development. Now, that is very, very, very important with respect to our national food security agenda, which is also tied to the regional food security agenda. Um, what I would like to do, Dr. Tara, is to focus a little bit more on the numbers, the fiscal, the impact at the household level, because that's the ultimate bottom line. And I must also note that this is perhaps the first budget that I have seen very little criticism, even coming from the opposition uh, quarters, the opposition segment. Very little criticism, nothing of substance, and this is very, very interesting, which in of itself tells or signals to me that this budget is welcome. And if I'm to paraphrase the Attorney General, in a very simple rebuttal he put forward towards his opponents in the National Assembly, he said that the the government just came out of an election. They won the last election. They've won by a significant margin from 33 seats to 36 seats. They campaign on the agenda in the budget. The budget is the operationalization of those plans, the the framework in which those plans, programs, and initiatives are going to be implemented, which they've campaigned on, they've articulated in their manifesto, and all the various consultative processes. And so the Attorney General is quite right in that framing of his rebuttal, that and which is reflective, in my view, based on the feedback from the public, political opposition, as well as the general public. Very little criticism I've seen, which is reflective of the result of the election. This is what the people voted for, and this is what was presented in the budget. Now, having said that, the common argument always is what is in the budget for the people. The budget was presented under the theme focusing on people, or something of that sort. And critics of government said that this budget is not for the people, that there is nothing in it for the people. Now, that notion, Dr. Singh, is unarguably a highly unintelligent view of the budget, a highly unintelligent view, unintelligent assertion of the budget. Because as you mentioned, as you reference the national data, the preliminary census report, our population has is now, for the first time, it has crossed the $1 million mark. The population, according to the Minister of Finance in his presentation, based on what they have extrapolated from the 2022 census, To date, it is estimated at 1,025,000 people. That's our population resident in Guyana. Now, I could recall when I look at the previous census, and this is very important in terms of policy making. The previous census, which is the 2012 census, that census, when you look at the age demographic of the population, 70% of the population, based on the 2012 census, were below the below the age of 40, 40 and below. 70%. That means you have a very young population. And I rather suspect, and I've asked the Bureau of Statistics just to give an indication, and it was confirmed that that composition of the population remained virtually unchanged. About 67% of the population, nearly 70%, are below the age of 40 or 40 and below. 70%. Now that's 70% of 1,025,000 people or citizens. Well, I would imagine that would comprise of Guyanese as well as expats and non-Guyanese working here as well. Now, why am I making reference to the population and the age demographic? Because a government, a government's responsibility is to develop, manage an economy that not only takes into account the short-term needs of people, but to also focus on, importantly, and more so on the future. A population that is 70% a young population, that means you have to create opportunities for them. That means you have to create quality opportunities. That means you have to create job opportunities, investment opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities. And hence, this is why it is important that the government invest in building out the productive sectors of the economy. And in order to build out the productive sectors of the economy, then you have to invest in the infrastructure. You have to invest in the bridges, in the road, expanding the road network. You have to build the power plant. Just look what is happening in the energy sector. In the how energy demand is driven by three categories of demand: residential, commercial, and industrial. We are not a heavily industrial economy as yet, but we're expected to be a far more robust industrialized economy post gas to energy when the power plant comes in stream and we have cheaper energy. But from the residential demand alone, government has had to double the investments that the government has made in the energy sector over the last 5 years. They've had to double that because the demand for energy consumption has doubled. And, and that rise in demand is driven by housing development. That too was reflected or corroborated in the census data. The census shows the increase in the building stock of the country from 2012 to 2022. And that building stock includes new households added to that building stock. And when you do the numbers, on average, based on the census data, we have added about 6,000 new households annually on average. So 6,000 new households to the grid annually, that drove the demand for energy consumption, hence the importance of the power plant. So when we look at the investment in those infrastructure, this is how it directly translates to our lives. Imagine now if we did not invest in doubling the capacity of the energy sector, and we didn't have the energy, the power plant project, and we're adding 6,000 new households on the grid energy consumption. What will that, how will that affect people? How will that affect people? It means 6,000 households added each year to the national grid consuming energy, they would be in blackout. You'd have unstable power. So the investment in the energy sector is important to cater for that rise in housing and the rise in population as well. Again, it's people. That's for the people. The Now, if we look at to put the budget into perspective, if we are to put the budget into perspective and to understand the impact, now let's talk about household income. In economic analysis, and as you would know this well, Dr. Singh, you really can't you can't do economic analysis year over year. It doesn't tell you the story because it takes time for the policies to take effect. It takes time for the investments, capital investments, capital projects in building out the productive sectors. That takes time before you can see the result. So the investment made, for instance, in the agriculture sector and in the infrastructure sector, it takes time before we can reap the produce if you when you're investing in agriculture to build out that infrastructure. It takes time to build and continuously invest in the power plant until we start to reap that result. It takes time to expand the road network until we can start seeing the results of that. But in the meanwhile, during the development stages, until we get these projects are completed and we start to reap the the maximum net benefit from these projects in terms of creating new opportunities, in terms of productivity, in terms of increased production capacity, goods and services, better standard of living, elevating the our overall standard of living, and how we conduct our livelihood, our quality of life. All that takes time, but in the meanwhile, in the development phases, there's still you have opportunities being created because we have to build these things, and to build these things we have to employ people. Somebody has to supply the goods and services, and that create investment opportunities for businesses. Now, let's look at the impact. Government, the President Ali government, this is his second term. So we have at least 5 years of data that we can look back to see what is the impact of his 5 year term, his first 5 year term in office of the PPP government. What's the impact? And I want to emphasize rather the impact on household income and put that into perspective. Now, let me explain for the benefit of the viewers how I derive these numbers before I get into the numbers. Now, household income is comprised of wages and wages, remittances, government subsidies. Government subsidies comprise of targeted cash transfers, and we know them well. It includes pension, old age pension, service pension, all the different sources of household income. I've collected those data, NIS data, cash transfer data, because we care cash grant, the indirect subsidies by removing that 50% waiver on fuel, for example, foregone revenue, the reversal of the 200 plus taxes back in 2020, which restored over $60 billion dollars in disposable income, the increase in income tax threshold. So all of that data, I've calculated or estimated rather household income. And how I calculated the net disposable income, I use the wages figure, which is reported in the budget estimates. I use the PAYE figure, income tax, and I use the effective tax rate, which would have come down from based on all the changes the government implemented over the past 5 years, increasing the tax threshold and reducing the income tax. The effective income tax rate came down from about 28% to 25% to, in the 2025 changes, came down to 17%. So using the effective tax rate and the excuse me, and the PAYE data and self-employed data reported in the budget estimates, we can calculate the net disposable income, right? And then I've also included remittances, and you'd be quite surprised how the composition of household income has changed over the years. So first, let's look at just net income, just wages alone. Wages alone, let's look at where it was in 2010. In 2010, and this is just what is captured in the tax bracket, right? This excludes um, wages not captured in the tax bracket, and or what we would want to say in the informal economy, or and those below the income tax threshold, right? So just tax paying persons alone in 2010 is $43 billion annually. By 2015, wages increased to 78 billion, or by 81%. By 2020, wages increased to 127 billion, and by 2025, wages increased by 416 billion. So from between 2015 to 2025, the wages net disposable income the household almost triple, or, well, more than triple actually, more than triple, 227%. So that's wages alone, okay? Now let's factor in all the government support and the subsidies and old age pension and all of that. If we factor that in, the total wages plus other income that I just described, the total, let's call that household income now. Total household income in 2010 was $60 billion. By 2015, rose to $132 billion. By 2020, rose to $221 billion. And by 2025, rose to $844 billion. Almost $1 trillion. And this excludes informal wages. Now listen to the composition and how the composition of household income change, and this speaks directly to the impact of government policies. In 2010, government support to household income, that is cash transfers, old age pension and subsidies and indirect subsidies and that type of stuff, in 2010 accounted for 28% of total household income. By 2015, government support to household income through government policies, fiscal incentives, and targeted transfers by 2015 rose to 41%. This is where the PPPC government left it in 2015. From 2010 to 2015, from 28% to 50% supporting household income. By 2020, now between 2015 and 2020, there was negligible movement in government support or government-backed support to household income. It only rose by 42.5% from 40.9%. And we know why that happened. We know what happened in 2015 to 2020. You had the sugar industry closed down. We had high rates of unemployment. And so the government then, the APNO FC government took away the Because We Care cash grant, and it's reflected in the numbers. Now, I explain how I calculate these numbers because anybody else could go and repeat this exercise and get the same answer, right? So you don't have to you could test this, you could do your assignment for the viewers looking at this. These are not numbers I just plucked from the sky. I've given you the source of the data. I've explained what comprise household income, what are the various components that comprise household income, and how it was calculated. So by 2020, government support to household income was 42.5%, not much change, just a 1.6 percentage point change from where it was in 2015. By 2025, we've seen some improvement here now. By 2025, all the subsidies, the cash transfers, the increase in old age pensions, the increase in subsidies, the removal of taxes, foregone revenue from all the cost of living measures. Remember how much I told you the total household income was by 2025? 844 billion. Government social transfers and other support alone accounted for 51% of household income. So in other words, government programs, the policies that the government has instituted, the fiscal incentives, increasing the income tax threshold, reducing the income tax, and all the other support incentives aimed at increasing disposable income, all those altogether have resulted in the support, the supplementary, the cushioning of household income, total household income, on top of wages and salaries earned by the household by 51%. 51%. Are you there? I saw this screen went up.
Yeah, there's some. Okay, you know what? We'll take.
Sorry, good.
Hold on.
Here is.
Shamisa, we will take a break and come back. We'll take a break now and come back.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Okay, okay, we are back. I just, we take your point about the impact that government spending is having on the household. Not many politicians understand that level of impact. They're they're going like in certain areas that are poor. They will canvass these people and they'll say, well, they're still living in poverty. There's pressure of cost of living. They can't make ends meet. Cost of living pressure has been an important tool for the opposition to attack the government. During the election campaign, opposition used two main things: corruption and cost of living pressure, to woo their supporters. So, at the individual household level, that is where people do not understand the extent to which government help them. What you're saying statistically is correct, but people do not understand that. How do we convey to them? How do we get them to understand the magnitude of the help? Like 61%, like every dollar they get, 60% is at the behest of the government. How we get them to understand that?
There's another important point I want to make on that. The remittance. And it'd
Go
be
ahead.
interesting to know what's the composition of remittance on household income. Now, in 2010, remittances accounted for 51% of total household income. By 2015, remittances accounted for 32% of household income. By 2020, remittance accounted for 20%. Now, 2020, globally, that was a COVID pandemic year, right? So we have to situate that context or that backdrop for 2020. But let's come to 2025. 2025, remittances accounted for 10% of household income. So government supporting total household income by 51%, government support, 51%. And you have remittances accounting for only 10%, down from 51% in 2010. Now, that's some interesting perspective um,
Okay.
to
The other clarification I want to make here is that you said how the total household income has expanded. Now, but also more people would have gotten into the labor force. The Minister of Finance said that during 2020 to 2025, they create over 100,000 jobs. So
no,
if you get these
in the
people in,
transport. Right. So yeah, and that's a conservative number. Now, the transportation sector alone, if you look at the disaggregated data in the importation of or the registration of vehicles, right? You have hire cars, lorries, buses, vans, tractors. Those types of vehicles are income generating vehicles. That's job creation. That's income generating. So in the last 5 years, we've registered 9,742 new hire cars on the road. Lorries, we've registered 12,890 lorries on the road. That means 9,742 hire car drivers, 12,890 truck drivers, minibus 5,815, new minibuses registered, that's 5,815 minibus drivers and conductors, vans 7,617, tractors, and this is in the agriculture sector more so, 2,928, right? So in the transportation sector alone and other sectors, my calculation is about 70,000 new jobs. 70,000 new jobs. right? So I gave you that example just to corroborate the minister of finance numbers in his presentation. That when he says 100,000 or 100,000 and change, one sector alone is probably half of that, account for half of that. We didn't talk about the construction
Mhm.
sector. Remember the housing stock data, 6,000 new households added. So imagine if you're building 6,000 new homes annually, and you have an average of,
Mhm.
let's say, 5 laborers per household, per new housing unit. That's 6,000 times five in employment in the construction sector in
Yeah.
housing alone. And we talk
Well,
about road infrastructure.
let me just make a point here. Don't you think it's time the last labor force study that was done in 2021? Don't you think, given the level of economic development, the rapid pace, don't you think that the government should organize another labor force, manpower?
They're doing that.
Um,
They're already working on that. That's a work
oh,
in
they're working on
progress.
it. So
Yeah.
that will give us a good insight into
They're
labor
doing
force
several key,
participation.
so the Bureau of Stats, they're doing several key things. Um, they updated labor force survey. They're doing an economic survey. That economic survey, a national economic survey, will speak to the true rate of poverty, not the estimated abstract rate that being referenced to, which is completely inaccurate. So
Let,
that economic survey will speak to the true and more accurate rate of poverty.
let me just ask you, who's conducting that survey? Bureau of
The
Statistics
Bureau
or
of
who?
Statistics. The Bureau of Statistics, yeah.
Okay, all right. Go ahead. You're making a point about the impact on the household level. Now you have demonstrated this well with the income, but as I said, getting the people who benefit from it to understand the magnitude of the help is not getting down to the people. That's what I'm saying. How do we get a message down to them? What method do we use?
Yeah. I could go further. We can talk about the savings deposits in the banking sector. And,
Go
and,
ahead.
and you had raised an important point, and this is important as well. This is an important insight in my view. The total individuals or the total private sector deposits has grown from 183 billion in 2010 to 890 billion by the end of 2025. Now, private sector deposits comprise of individual savings as well as business enterprise. Now, the composition changed a bit from 2010. Business enterprise accounted for about 80% of total deposits. In 2025, um, sorry, in 2010, individual deposits accounted for about 80% of total deposits. And in 2025, business enterprise accounted for a higher share of total deposits. Households account for about 60% of total deposits. Now, on the question of inflation, and you had asked me this question. On the question of inflation, there is something in economics, there's a metric in economics called marginal propensity to consume. You look at the marginal propensity to consume is a metric that simply tells or indicates what percentage of additional income earned is consumed. What percentage of additional income earned is consumed. Now, in 2015, in 2015, the marginal propensity to consume, or between that 2015-2020 period, was 1.75 or 175%. Now, what that means is that, and it correlates back to the broader economic conditions at that time. A marginal propensity to consume of 175% means that people were spending more than they were earning, more than the additional income earned, which meant that that additional that they spent more than they earned, the 0.75 more, they either have to borrow it or they withdraw from their savings. And if you look at the numbers, you would see that they didn't borrow, it came from their savings. And that speaks to the economic conditions of the country, of the economy at that time, which was very bad, high rates of unemployment, um, the draconian policies of the then government, raising taxes, raising the fees, putting VAT on electricity and all of that. And so people spend more than the additional income earned by drawing it down from their savings, because you saw the dip in savings during that period, which correlated to that. Now, now the marginal propensity to consume is 60%. So that means people are spending 60 cents of every additional dollar earned, which is a good thing,
Mhm.
because that explains why we have the high levels of savings rate or liquidity in the financial sector, right? And it's a good thing, but it's a very concerning thing as well. It's a good thing that they're saving 40% of it and only spending 60% of it, because if you have a sudden surge in spending, then we're in trouble in terms of inflation. We're going to be in trouble in terms of inflation. And that is why now we can tie that to the financial market and capital market development that the government is actively and aggressively pursuing, because they recognize there's a lot of liquidity in the system, there's a lot of savings deposit in the system, and government knows that if people spend all that money, we're going to have runaway inflation. So we have to find investment vehicles and instruments to channel that money, that excess money, towards investing in instruments, investing in assets that they can earn higher rates of return than what they're earning right now in the bank. The bank rate right now is below the level, the below the rate of inflation, which means if you keep your money in the bank, you're losing value over time. You really want to have a return on your excess savings or your excess liquidity that is higher than the rate of inflation, right, to get a good return on your investment. So recognizing all of that, I think the government is doing the right things and pursuing the right set of policies and development agenda in terms of capital market development to contain or to mitigate these macro risks that are very we have to look at very, very carefully.
Okay, if somebody approach you on the street, an ordinary citizen, so well, Mr. Bhagwandin, can you tell me what's in this budget for me as a head of the household? I have three children, two of them going to school, I alone working, my wife is not working. What, how do you explain what is in the budget for that family?
But the children alone, their cash grants have gone up. If you have three children, the cash grant for school children moved from 10,000 per child to now 60,000 per child. So if you have three children, that's 60,000 times three plus the transportation grant per child. So that's 80,000 per child when you add the transportation grant.
Mm,
So you would see this year in 20, so you see where it landed in 2025, right? In
mhm.
2026, we would see how it would impact household income. But that's what's in it for such a household. Then the pensioners are getting a transportation grant as well. And if there are other persons in the household, there are opportunities for them to take advantage of, to learn a new skill at the expense of government, to get support from a development bank, to get training and technical support to put together their business plan, to get financial support at zero interest to invest in a productive asset or a venture that could generate income, additional income for that household. And when we look at the level of disposable income in the economy, there is spending power in the economy to support the growth of businesses. There is spending power in the economy to support the growth of businesses. And hence, this is why the development bank is very, very important, is an essential part of the next phase of development. If we look at, I like to look at the five stages of development, preconditions to
Um,
take off for the takeoff.
you know, are
This,
you are you
this,
comfortable? Are you comfortable with the development bank because government, prior government had this concept of development. You had a national co-op bank, you had the agriculture development bank run by government, and they are run to the ground. I'm a bit skeptical when you have banks and it's run by by the state. What are your views on that?
so historically, yes, historically in the context of Ghana, yes, we've experimented with development banking, that type of stuff, which failed for many different reasons at that time. Now we have the benefit of all those lessons. We have the benefit of all those lessons, and we have also the benefit of the changing dynamics of the market and the changing behavior of the market. Now, if you look at the level of non performing loans in the banking sector, one commercial bank has zero non performing loan. And overall in this sector, we have historically the lowest level of non performing loans in the banking sector or in the financial sector. Now, that's indicative of the quality of lending opportunities. It is also indicative of the behavior of the market because, and this still remains, there was a time when the behavior of borrowers, they borrow the money from the bank and they have no intention of repaying that money. Some of them even had the view that you take my property. In his mind, he sold the property to you, he get the cash. The borrower has no intention of repaying that loan because in his mental mapping of that transaction, he's not interested in the property. He sold the property to the bank. But the bank is not in the business of real estate. The bank is not really interested in buying and selling your property. The bank is interested in good lending, good bankable, viable lending, good businesses. So that was very prominent 15 years ago. It still is, but to a lesser extent, which is good. And that the low level of non-performing uh, loans in the banking sector, to my mind, tells that story of the change in behavior. Now, you're still going to have unscrupulous people, you're still going to have, other than unscrupulous kind of behavior by borrowers, you're going to have
Mhm.
genuine cases of where a business would going through their the business cycle, for many different reasons, would not do well, would fall short in cash flow and would not be able to pay, and so on. So you will have inherently a a failure rate. The objective is to minimize that failure rate, but there will be failure rate. Startups always have a high failure rate. How do we mitigate that? And this is important, how the development bank, the model of the development bank, that is. The model of the development bank is one that has to provide technical support, not just lend the money and leave it or leave the borrowers to go. It has to provide technical support from the beginning to the end. in terms of providing training and technical support and preparing a business plan, building your business case, and even in the monitoring and evaluation. So, from my banking experience, that's the model that would help to ensure a successful model of the development bank and minimizing the rate of failure,
Mm.
right?
Dr.
Okay.
Tara,
Yeah.
if I may, can we have Joel explain the NIS pension? There are quite a few people in the
Yeah.
comments.
I'm going to ask, yeah, that's
Okay.
the pension now, the old age pension, the government increased by 5,000, which for the year will be 60,000. Plus they add additional 20,000 for travel. That's 80,000. Roughly converted, that is 372 US per year they get additional. Some people are saying that is inadequate. What are your views on that?
I've every budget cycle I deal with this. This always comes up every budget cycle, and we always have to remind that very few countries have a policy of such where they're providing an old age pension to senior citizens, because the old age pension is not your service pension that you work for your entire professional life, whether you work Gaisuku or wherever you work. You still have your service pension that you would have worked and earned. That is different from the old age pension.
Right.
When old age pension was introduced way back by this government many years ago, and very few countries have an additional pension on top of your service pension, it was intended to supplement your service pension. So that framing, that context, that historical rationale and fact gets ignored, and people who don't know this would think, oh my god, oh, this is all the pension the government is paying. But no, that's a supplementary pension on top of your service pension.
Yeah,
And then, of
but
course, there are other support that senior citizens benefit
yeah,
from
well, I agree. Like they get vouchers, etc. But listen,
vouchers, they get health
not
care, they get
many people.
subsidized electricity,
Okay,
subsidized water,
let me make
and
it. You're right. But
of
let me
course,
make this
the cash grant as well, they would benefit from that, and
right.
all the other
Yeah, yeah,
incentives everyone
but
else
let
will
me
get.
make this point about the old age pension. Many people who get old age pension do not get NIS pension because they're not qualified, they don't work, they never pay any contribution. A lot of them, which I know. So that general thing to say they also get pension is not necessarily accurate.
And
So anyhow,
yeah, you're correct. And there's a lot of persons who had issues with their contribution. And you would recall in previous budgets, the government sought to remedy those by making a payout to persons who would not have reached their contribution, for example, and they still got a payout for whatever contribution they made there.
right.
So there were several other
Mhm.
interventions of such. In those circumstances that the government has remedied or sought to remedy in previous budgets in their previous term.
So let me just ask you, with all the cash transfer that the government has done or proposed to do for this fiscal year, what proportion of the budget that will amount to how much? 20%, 30%?
Uh, so I'm glad you asked that, because that you're now venturing into the question of fiscal sustainability. Now, so let me deal with that. The total budget was $1.5 trillion, right?
Hmm.
That gives you a fiscal deficit of 487.5 billion dollars. Total revenue, including the withdrawal from the NRF, amounted to 1 trillion 66 billion. 1,066,000,000,000. Non-oil revenue is 514 billion. The NRF withdrawal is 495 billion, less than non-oil revenue, tax revenue that is. The funds from the natural resource fund is less than the tax revenue, 495 billion as against 514 billion. Now, the current expenditure alone, which include wages and salaries for public servants, which include all the social welfare expenditure, which include the cash transfers, which include general and administrative expenses for the public sector, is 740 billion, which is greater than the total non-oil revenue. $740 billion over 514 billion, which is your non-oil revenue. Now let's explain the implication of that in terms of fiscal sustainability. While the average person, or let me move it away from the average person, or and focus it on the critics or opponents of government, that the social welfare spend is not sufficient, and they could always argue forever that it's not sufficient. We have to situate that within the fiscal framework, within the framework of fiscal sustainability. Today, oil prices is back where it was in 2015. The recurrent expenditure already is greater than your current revenue, non-tax revenue. And to increase the size of recurrent expenditure far greater than your non-tax revenue is going to be fiscally unsustainable. You're going to create, if the framework to weaken the fiscal structure, to weaken the fiscal framework of the entire macroeconomy, which we've been through that period already. So when you look at the composition of the budget, capital versus recurrent expenditure, you really should not be borrowing money to spend on recurrent expenditure, things like social welfare and so on. And this is why the capital budget is important, because people argue, the political opponents argue that we're spending too much in infrastructure, but failing to realize how will you sustainably create wealth in the economy? How will you sustainably create new sources of income, new sources of tax revenue, so that you can pay better social welfare packages to people? But there is only one way to do it, by building out the productive sectors so that you could have more productive activities, so that you could generate more income, you could generate more wealth, you could generate more revenue. Therefrom, you generate more taxes.
Yeah.
If you cut on the capital budget and you raise the recurrent expenditure, then you can't sustain it, because you will not be creating new income streams. And if you're not creating new income streams and you keep raising the recurrent expenditure, you keep spending on social welfare, then how are you going to sustain that? That's the recipe for bankruptcy.
Right.
That's the
Right.
recipe for fiscal collapse.
Okay. Thank you very much. We've just passed the program time by a few minutes, but I've hand you over now to Shamisa. I don't know if you have any questions for Joel
Well,
before he
thank you,
makes
Dr.
a
Tara.
closing remark.
We do have quite a few, people share their opinion on how they feel a lot of it had to do with pension. But Joel, this is my question to you. And thank you. Those are some very impressive numbers that you just gave us, and explaining everything that you did. Very impressive. Now, the topic tonight that we're discussing is what's in it for the a normal person in Guyana, right? Um, Guyana being a country that is now in 2025, we had a poverty rate of 58%. 32% of those are living in extreme poverty. How do you feel this budget will benefit those people? And I get your numbers, right? But we're talking about the average Guyanese right now. How are they going to understand what impact those numbers that you just mentioned have on them, and how is this going to benefit them on a personal level?
So the budget, when you look at the budget holistically, the budget is designed to alleviate poverty, to reduce the rate of poverty. For historical context, when we were a bankrupt country, our poverty rate was over 90%. Over 90% of the population was in poverty.
When
Today,
was this?
this is way back in the 80s, right?
Okay.
Poverty rate was in the 90% range. Today, the poverty rate is not 54% as some people are saying. It's under 20%. That's where it is. If you do the economic survey, you will see, and there are different measurements of poverty. There are different ways to measure poverty. And each method would give you a different result. For example, there is the multidimensional approach. The multidimensional approach measures poverty in terms of access to good health care, access to education, what percentage of the population has access to education, healthcare, housing, electricity, water, that type of stuff. If we do the multidimensional approach, then the poverty rate is very low. If we do the monetary approach, then without the data, that is a subjective argument. Without the data, that's a subjective argument, but I can tell you it's not 54%, right? So,
58.
so,
58
so,
is.
so it's not, no, not 58%. It's less than 20%. The economic survey that the Bureau of Stats is doing will derive the a more realistic rate where that number is, but I can tell you it's not 54%. To your question, poverty, and this is my answer. My answer is there is only the primary factor, or if there is a single thing that would take us out of poverty, is education. What are we doing about education? Free education. The question that we have to really ask, are we taking advantage of this? Are we taking advantage of free education all the way to the tertiary level? And it's not only academic, but also on the technical vocational side. So the biggest tool to eradicate poverty is education. Learn a new skill. If you're not academically oriented, learn a new skill. The second is access to how do you build wealth? Home ownership, land ownership, the accumulation of assets. We have one of the most affordable, comprehensively affordable housing policy anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. When you look at the housing incentives, land ownership, the added subsidies that the government has provided, we're getting, where else in the world are you getting interest-free loan? Interest-free loan for housing. When you accumulate that asset, now imagine 6,000 new households, new 6,000 families every year. That's the census data. This term, the government is looking to build at 8,000. Take that number up to 8,000. You're talking about empowering 8,000 families per annum with home ownership. And the government is providing all the incentives in the form of subsidy, in the form of low cost loan, interest-free loan. Well, effectively, it's interest-free because first-time home borrowers will be eligible for the mortgage interest relief. Then the other thing is healthcare. Government has a robust plan for the healthcare sector in terms of improving primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare. So they've invested in all these regional hospitals across the country. That is to improve access and to decentralize healthcare in terms of secondary healthcare services. In the tertiary healthcare services, we only have one tertiary healthcare facility in the country. That is the Georgetown Public Hospital. The government is now looking to build a second tertiary healthcare facility to provide free and accessible healthcare to the population. So, poverty, health, and education and housing, those are the three biggest things in the budget for the average person to get out of poverty. And the fourth thing is access to capital. If you want to grow and if you're smart, you have business acumen, you take advantage of the training, you educate yourself, you're healthy, then entrepreneurship, the development bank, the small business bureau grant, and all the training to help support that.
Okay. Joel, you mentioned education. Let's touch on education. What was the number of increase that teachers and nurses got in this budget?
Normally, they don't announce the number, they do that later in the year. But if you look at the variance between last year's figure and this year's figure, budgeted allocation for wages and salaries, you would see what that is. But that would account for increase as well as new employees, right? But I just recall the government would have entered into a multi-year agreement with several unions, the Guyana Teachers Union, the GAU, and the GPSU. So their increments, those sectors, their increment is already known vis-a-vis the multi-year agreement they have with those unions, which I can't recall what the rates are off the cuff.
Well, I don't know because it was not mentioned in the budget, but I do see a lot of teachers complaining that they did not have a raise. I think it's over the 3 years, there was supposed to be a 3% increase over the years, and that's all that there has been so far.
They have to take them
Maybe
up with
next
their
year there would
union.
be more.
Yeah, they would have to take that up with the union because there
Right.
is a multi-year agreement which has not yet expired. That those multi-year agreements were only entered into last year, if I'm not mistaken.
Um, let me just make a point here. There's a large segment of the Guyanese population believe that the best way to relieve poverty is to pump money into them, cash transfer. That is a perception. I traveled throughout the country. As you know, I went to Guyana 3 times last year, and I'll be going back there shortly to visit a number of areas. They always believe that the best way to get out of poverty is government to inject direct cash. Education is too long term for them. Housing might be long term as well. Even though the World Bank says the best method used to bring people out of poverty, as I said, is education. That's the number one. And if people can utilize that, they're reluctant to because they see if you can, they hear about the treasury overflowing with all money, so they want money. You know, WP advocated for 5,000 US each for each household when the government treasury did not even have that amount of money to pay. So people get fixated with this money and the oil money and what the oil money is doing, etc. So that has been my observation, traveling through the country and talking to people. But we can't fix poverty through the injection of cash. You can give cash for temporary relief, as the government is doing targeted cash grants at the time. But you got to provide these people jobs. It's a good thing that the unemployment rate reduced from 12% now to 6%, 6.5%, which means that a lot of people would have automatically moved out of the poverty threshold. I'm talking about poverty of 58%. That was the IDB figure. I don't know where they got that figure from. Well, the World Bank give us a figure. Ghana being a middle income country now, $6.85 per person per day. The average household in Guyana is 3.3% now. And if you multiply that 3.3 by 6, about 18, 19, if a family of three earns 19, 20 US a day, that will keep them a little above the poverty line. But there's hardly anybody in Ghana now who's earning less than 25 US a day. Hardly any.
Thank you, Dr. Tara. And thank you to our guests, Joel Bhagwandin, for being here this evening. To all of our viewers, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Until next time, I am your host, Shamisa Ali, and this is the Guyana Dialogue. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, Shamisa. Thank you, Joel. Thank you for a very excellent presentation. I don't think many people still believe that you've dealt with the macro level, but you've dealt also effectively with the micro level at the personal level too. But people will always see things from their own prism. So thank you very much, and I guess we'll have you later on. Let's